dust choked the blistering California highway as a 300-pound Hell's Angel collapsed beside his smoking Harley. Most people would have locked their doors and accelerated, but an 11-year-old autistic boy didn't see a terrifying outlaw. He saw a hungry man. What happened next saved an entire family's legacy. The San Joaquin Valley heat in late July was unforgiving, baking the asphalt of Route 99 until the horizon blurred into a watery mirage. At Oakhaven Farm, 11-year-old Toby Henderson sat under the sprawling shade of a dying California live oak. For Toby, the world was a chaotic, overwhelmingly loud place, terrifying in its unpredictability. His autism meant that he found safety only in absolute unbreakable routine. Every Tuesday at exactly 12:30 p.m., Toby sat under this specific tree to eat his lunch. The parameters never changed: a bologna, and American cheese sandwich on white bread crusts, meticulously removed, cut into 4 identical squares. Beside it sat a thermos of ice-cold apple juice. If the squares were uneven, Toby couldn't eat. If the juice was warm, he would spiral into a panic. Routine was the anchor holding his fragile world together, especially since his father David had passed away from a sudden heart attack 8 months prior. On this particular Tuesday, the routine was shattered by a sound like a dying beast. A massive custom Harley-Davidson roared, sputtered, and backfired violently before skidding to a halt just 50 feet from Toby's oak tree. The man who dismounted was a mountain of scarred leather and faded denim. Arthur Pendleton, known simply as Bear to his brothers in the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, kicked the side stand down with a heavy steel-toed boot. Bear was in bad shape. A patch war in Nevada had forced him onto a rugged back-road detour. 3 days ago, a run-in with a rival crew had left him with a cracked rib, a busted oil line, and his saddlebags containing his wallet phone and provisions scattered in a ditch. He had been riding on fumes and pure stubborn adrenaline for 72 hours, nursing the damaged bike through the scorching desert. Now, in the 106-degree valley heat, his body was finally shutting down. Bear ripped off his heavy leather vest, revealing the iconic winged death head on the back, and slumped against the wooden fence of Oakhaven Farm. His vision swam. His mouth tasted of copper and dust. He hadn't eaten in 3 days, and severe dehydration was setting in. He closed his eyes, waiting for the dizziness to pass, resigning himself to the miserable reality that he might actually pass out on the side of a farm road. Your face is flushed. You are experiencing hypothermia. Bear's eyes snapped open. Standing exactly 3 feet away was a skinny, pale boy wearing noise-cancelling headphones around his neck. The kid wasn't looking at Bear's intimidating tattoos, his jagged facial scar, or the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The boy was staring intently at Bear's forehead. "Beat it, kid!" Bear rasped his voice, sounding like gravel grinding against glass. "I ain't in the mood." Toby didn't flinch. He didn't understand the social cues of danger that would have sent any other child running for their mother. He only understood facts and rules. "My mum says, when the cows get hypothermia, they stop producing milk, and then they fall down. You fell down. You need caloric intake and hydration." Bear let out a dry, coughing laugh, wincing as his cracked rib flared in protest. "Yeah. Well, unless your mum runs a diner, I'm out of luck. Go back to your house, boy." Instead of leaving, Toby knelt in the dry dirt. He opened his plastic Star Wars lunchbox. With immense care, he lifted the Tupperware container, holding his 4 perfect bologna squares. He looked at his sandwich, a fierce internal battle crossing his face. Breaking his lunch routine was physically painful for him. But another rule, a rule his late father had taught him, overrode the routine. We always take care of the hurt ones. Toby. Toby pushed the Tupperware toward the massive biker. Then he unscrewed the lid of his thermos and poured the ice-cold apple juice into its cup. He pushed that forward too. "Eat," Toby commanded, his voice flat and robotic, "or you will die." Bear stared at the small, perfectly cut sandwich. He looked at the boy, truly seeing him for the first time. The rigid posture, the lack of eye contact, the earnest, unfiltered honesty. The hardened outlaw, a man who had broken jaws and spent years in federal lockup, felt a strange tightness in his throat. He reached out with a trembling, grease-stained hand and took a square of the sandwich. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Bear devoured the sandwich in seconds and downed the apple juice, the cold liquid shocking his overheated system back to life. He let out a long, ragged exhale, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I owe you, kid," Bear said quietly, his tone entirely shifted. "What's your name?" "Toby Henderson. I live at Oak Haven Farm." Toby pointed toward the fading white farmhouse in the distance. "But we won't live here much longer." Bear frowned, leaning forward. "Why not?" "Because Mr. Caldwell said my mum is a liability, and the bank is taking our home on Friday." Toby recited perfectly echoing words he had overheard but didn't entirely process. "The cows are going away. My room is going away. I don't know where my routine will go." Toby's hands began to flap slightly at his sides, a self-soothing mechanism as the anxiety of the impending eviction bubbled up. Bear watched the boy carefully. He knew a thing or two about having your world ripped away. The Hell's Angel reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded red paisley bandana. It was grimy, but to Bear it was a talisman. He held it out to Toby. "Toby, listen to me," Bear said, making sure to keep his voice low and steady so as not to startle the boy. "You gave me your food. In my world, that makes us brothers. You keep this. You tell your mum that Bear said thank you." Toby stopped flapping. He took the bandana, examining the fabric, closely appreciating the geometric paisley patterns. "Okay, Bear." A passing trucker, seeing the downed biker, pulled over a few minutes later with a jug of coolant and a jumper pack. By the time Toby's mother Sarah came running out of the house, frantically searching for her son, Bear, and the Harley were gone. All that remained was Toby sitting quietly under the oak tree, holding a red bandana. "Toby, who were you talking to?" Sarah gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen the massive man in leather from the kitchen window and sprinted out in terror. "A hurt bear," Toby said simply. "I gave him my bologna. He gave me his cloth." Sarah hugged her son, tight tears of exhaustion pricking her eyes. She didn't have the energy to scold him. She was already drowning. Inside the farmhouse, the air was suffocatingly hot and thick with despair. Sarah Henderson sat at the kitchen table, her hands buried in her hair, surrounded by a mountain of past due notices stamped in angry red ink. Since David's death, everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. The tractor's transmission blew. The price of feed skyrocketed. A severe drought had decimated their hay yield. Sarah had taken out a secondary loan just to keep the dairy cattle fed, banking on a government agricultural subsidy that never materialized. The front door screen slammed shut. Sarah jumped. Standing in the foyer was Richard Caldwell, the senior loan officer from Valley Mutual Bank. Caldwell was a man who seemed to sweat arrogance. His tailored suit looked absurd against the backdrop of the dusty, struggling farm. "You're trespassing, Richard," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and exhaustion. "Just delivering the final courtesy notice, Sarah," Caldwell said smoothly, dropping a manila envelope onto the kitchen counter. "The grace period is over. The public auction is set for this Friday at 9 a.m. "You can't do this," Sarah pleaded, standing up. "I just need 30 more days. The dairy cooperative is reviewing my application for an emergency grant. I have the paperwork right." "Sarah, stop," Caldwell interrupted, holding up a manicured hand. "It's over. Valley Mutual isn't a charity. Honestly, it's for the best. A single mother with a special child. You can't run a dairy farm. I have a corporate agricultural buyer coming to the auction. They're prepared to buy the land, bulldoze these rotting barns, and build a modern processing facility. It's progress." He glanced in disgust at the living room where Toby was sitting on the floor, perfectly aligning his toy tractors in a straight line, over and over again. "Leave," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "Be packed by Friday." Caldwell replied coldly, turning on his heel and walking out. The next 3 days were a descent into hell. The reality of the auction meant that the cattle had to be catalogued. Men in heavy boots stomped through the barns, shouting and tagging the frightened cows. For Toby, the disruption of his sanctuary was agonizing. The noise, the strangers, the shifting of his animals, it triggered intense, heartbreaking meltdowns. On Thursday night, Toby lay on the floor of his bedroom, pressing his hands over his ears and rocking violently, sobbing without tears. Sarah lay next to him, wrapping her arms around him, singing softly until her throat went raw. She felt like an utter failure. She was losing David's legacy, and she was losing the only safe space her son had ever known. Friday morning dawned clear and relentlessly bright. By 8:30 a.m., the gravel driveway of Oakhaven Farm was lined with expensive pickup trucks and sedans. The vultures, as Sarah called them, had arrived. These were representatives from corporate farming conglomerates, local land developers, and bargain hunters, looking to pick over the bones of the Henderson family's life. An auctioneer named Higgins set up a portable PA system on the front porch. Sarah stood near the front door, her face pale and drawn, holding a small cardboard box containing David's framed photographs and a few sentimental items. It was really happening. Toby sat on the bottom step of the porch. He was completely silent, his noise-cancelling headphones securely over his ears. In his small, trembling hands, he clutched the greasy red bandana the biker had given him 4 days ago. He didn't understand the legalities of an auction, but he understood the heavy, suffocating sadness radiating from his mother. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this settled." Higgins's voice boomed over the scratchy speakers, making Sarah flinch. "We are here for the foreclosure auction of Oakhaven Farm, comprising 140 acres, outbuildings, and equipment. We will open the bidding at $250,000. Richard Caldwell leaned against the hood of his silver Mercedes, smiling smugly. He nodded to a man in a polo shirt beside him, the corporate buyer. $250, the man in the polo shirt called out lazily. "I have $250, Higgins droned. "Do I hear $275? Sarah closed her eyes, a single tear cutting a track down her dusty cheek. It was over. Then Toby suddenly ripped off his headphones. He stood up, his head tilting toward the highway. "Toby, honey, put those back on," Sarah whispered, reaching for him. "Do you hear it?" Toby asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Caldwell rolled his eyes. "Can someone keep the kid quiet so we can finish this?" But Higgins had stopped speaking. The men in the crowd were turning their heads toward Route 99. It started as a low, guttural vibration that seemed to shake the very dust on the ground. A deep, rhythmic thrumming that grew louder by the second. It wasn't the sound of an 18-wheeler. It sounded like a thunderstorm rolling in from the valley, but the sky was perfectly clear. The vibration turned into a roar. Sarah stepped to the edge of the porch, squinting against the morning sun. Over the crest of the highway, a single headlight appeared. Then another. Then 5. Then 20. A massive tightly formed column of motorcycles was turning off the highway and onto the dirt road leading to Oakhaven Farm. The deafening roar of V-twin engines echoed off the barns. The crowd of bidders backed away from the driveway alarmed as the bikes kept coming. 10, 30, 50. 80 heavily modified, gleaming Harley-Davidsons thundered into the yard in perfect, disciplined formation. The dust they kicked up formed a thick, intimidating cloud. The riders were massive men, clad in black leather denim and heavy boots. On the back of every single vest was the unmistakable red and white insignia of the Hells Angels. The corporate buyers froze. Richard Caldwell's smug smile vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror as the bikers surrounded the yard, effectively blocking the exit. The rumbling engines idled for a moment, shaking the windows of the farmhouse before shutting off in a synchronized wave of mechanical clicks and clanks. The sudden silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the noise. From the front of the pack, the largest biker dismounted. It was Bear. He looked entirely different than the starving, desperate man Toby had met by the tree. He was clean, his vest was immaculate, and his presence commanded absolute authority. Behind him stood 79 of his brothers from chapters across California and Nevada. Bear walked slowly toward the porch. The crowd of bidders parted for him, like the Red Sea, averting their eyes. He walked right past the trembling auctioneer, right past the terrified loan officer, and stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked down at Toby. Toby looked up at him, then held out the red bandana. "You came back," Toby said, matter-of-factly. Bear smiled, a genuine warm expression that didn't match the terrifying skull patch on his chest. "I told you, Toby. In my world, when someone feeds you, they become your brother. And nobody takes a brother's home." Bear turned slowly to face the crowd, his eyes locked onto Richard Caldwell. "So," Bear rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent yard, "I hear there's an auction." The silence in the yard was absolute, broken only by the sound of hot exhaust pipes, ticking as they cooled. 80 men wearing the infamous winged deathhead insignia stood in a loose, semicircular formation around the porch, their arms crossed, their expressions carved from stone. Richard Caldwell, the arrogant loan officer, suddenly looked very small inside his expensive suit. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "This is a private, legally binding foreclosure auction," he stammered, his voice lacking its previous venom. You gentlemen are disrupting a financial proceeding." "We ain't disrupting anything, Suit." Bear rumbled, walking up the wooden steps. His heavy boots thumped ominously against the floorboards. "We're here to participate in the free market. Isn't that right, Higgins?" The auctioneer. Higgins gripped his microphone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Yes. Yes. Bidding is open to the public." The corporate buyer from the agricultural conglomerate, a man named Harrison, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let a motorcycle club intimidate his company out of prime real estate. "I opened the bidding at $250,000, Harrison stated, though his voice trembled slightly. $250,001, Bear replied instantly. Harrison frowned. $275,000. Bear didn't even blink. $275,001. Harrison turned back to the crowd of bikers, a massive man with a graying beard, an eye patch, and a patch that read Sonny took a single step forward. Beside him, a towering biker known as Iron Mike cracked his knuckles, a sound like dry branches snapping. Not a single threat was spoken. They didn't draw weapons. They simply stood there, a unified wall of intimidating loyalty staring directly into Harrison's soul. 300,000? Harrison squeaked out, stepping closer to Caldwell's Mercedes. $300,001. Bear said, his tone utterly bored. "Mr. Caldwell, do something," Harrison hissed under his breath. "This is an intimidation tactic." Caldwell puffed out his chest, trying to muster some authority. "Now see here, you cannot simply outbid us by $1, just to—" "Actually, according to the California Civil Code regarding public auctions," interrupted a bespectacled biker, stepping out from the crowd, wearing a patch that read, "Rusty, bids can be raised in any increment unless the auctioneer sets a specific minimum raise." Higgins didn't set a minimum. Rusty pushed his glasses up his nose. "I was a corporate paralegal before I bought my Harley." "Keep going, Bear." Higgins gulped. We have a bid for $300,001. Harrison looked at the 80 heavily tattooed, uncompromising men standing between him and his vehicle. He looked at Bear, whose cold, dead-eyed stare promised a lifetime of misery if Harrison uttered another number. The corporate buyer did the math. No piece of land was worth dealing with the Hells Angels. "I'm out," Harrison muttered. He didn't even wait for a response. He shoved past Caldwell, power-walked to his rental car, and peeled out of the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. The other bargain hunters in the crowd suddenly found the gravel fascinating. Nobody made a sound. "Going once," Higgins squeaked into the microphone. "Going twice. Sold." Higgins brought his wooden gavel down with a weak tap against the podium. Caldwell was furious, his face flushing crimson. "This is a farce. You don't have that kind of capital. You have 24 hours to produce certified funds, or the bid is voided and the property reverts to the bank." Bear smiled, reaching inside his heavy leather cut. He pulled out a thick legal envelope and slapped it hard against Caldwell's chest. Caldwell instinctively caught it. "You're right, Caldwell. We don't have 300,000. Bear said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "But I did some digging. Rusty found the exact payoff amount for Sarah's secondary arrears. The default amount that triggered this whole auction. It's $42,610. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Inside that envelope," Bear continued, "is a cashier's check from the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, San Joaquin Chapter's Community Fund, made out to Valley Mutual Bank for exactly $42,610. Under the state's right of redemption law, paying off the defaulted debt before the transfer of the deed nullifies the foreclosure." Caldwell ripped open the envelope. His eyes bulged as he stared at the certified bank check. It was flawless, legitimate, undeniable. "The farm isn't sold." "Caldwell," Bear said, stepping so close that the loan officer had to lean back over the porch railing. "The debt is cleared. The farm belongs to Sarah and Toby. Now get off their property before my brothers and I decide we need some exercise." Caldwell looked at the 80 men who had now taken a collective step toward the porch. Without a single word, the loan officer shoved the check into his briefcase, scrambled down the steps, and practically dove into his Mercedes. He sped down the driveway, completely ignoring the speed bumps. The heavy, oppressive silence held for a moment longer. Then a massive cheer erupted from the bikers. The sound of 80 rugged outlaws hollering in victory echoed across the California valley. Sarah fell to her knees on the porch, sobbing uncontrollably. The suffocating weight that had been crushing her chest for 8 months vanished in an instant. She was safe. Toby was safe. Bear knelt beside her, his massive hands gently hovering over her shaking shoulders. "It's all right, Sarah. You're clear. The farm is yours." "How?" Sarah choked out, looking up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "Why would you do this for us?" Bear looked over to where Toby was sitting on the bottom step. The boy had put his noise-cancelling headphones back on to block out the cheering, but he was watching Bear intently. "Last Tuesday I was dying on the side of Route 99, Bear said softly. "People drove past me for 3 hours. But your boy didn't. He broke his routine to give me his lunch. He saved my life. In the club, loyalty is everything. We protect our own. And the moment Toby handed me that sandwich, he became one of our own. The Hells Angels didn't just save the farm on paper. They saved it in reality. Instead of riding off into the sunset, the 80 men set up a temporary camp in the back pasture. For the entire weekend, Oakhaven Farm was transformed into a chaotic, beautiful construction zone. The bikers, many of whom were skilled mechanics, carpenters, and tradesmen in their civilian lives, went to work. Iron Mike and 3 others tore apart the blown transmission on Sarah's tractor, ordering parts from a local supplier and rebuilding it by Sunday afternoon. Sonny led a crew that repainted the peeling red barns, while others repaired miles of sagging wire fencing. They pooled their own money to fill the silos with premium cattle feed, ensuring the dairy cows would thrive through the rest of the drought. But the most remarkable part of the weekend wasn't the physical labor. It was how these hardened men interacted with Toby. They quickly learned the rules of Toby's world. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. No loud revving near the house. No sudden movements around the kid. Don't touch his toy tractors. Men who routinely struck fear into the hearts of rival gangs tiptoed around the farmhouse. When Toby came out to inspect the tractor repairs, Iron Mike, a man with teardrop tattoos and a rap sheet longer than a highway, spoke in a hushed, gentle whisper, explaining the mechanics of the diesel engine to the fascinated boy. Toby didn't make eye contact, but he listened, completely absorbed by the logical, systematic breakdown of the machinery. By Tuesday afternoon, the farm was transformed. The tractor was humming, the barns looked new, and the threat of eviction was a distant nightmare. At 12:25 p.m., the roar of motorcycles filled the air one last time as the chapter prepared to hit the highway. Bear stood by his repaired Harley, adjusting his leather vest. Sarah walked up to him, handing him a basket filled with fresh produce from her garden and a thermos of coffee. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you, Arthur," Sarah said, using his real name. Bear chuckled, securing the basket to his saddlebags. "You already did, Sarah. Just keep raising a good man." He looked toward the dying oak tree. At exactly 12:30 p.m., Toby walked out of the house. He carried his Star Wars lunchbox and his thermos. He sat down under the shade, crossing his legs. He opened the box and took out his Tupperware. Inside were 4 perfectly cut squares of a bologna and American cheese sandwich. Bear walked over his heavy boots, crunching softly on the dry grass. He stopped exactly 3 feet away. "Mind if I join you, Toby?" Bear asked. Toby looked up. He assessed the giant biker. Then Toby reached into his lunchbox and pulled out a second Tupperware container. Inside were 4 more perfectly cut squares of bologna and cheese. He pushed it toward Bear. "I made extra," Toby said flatly, "in case you experienced hypothermia again." Bear smiled, sitting down in the dirt, cross-legged, his massive frame looking entirely out of place under the tree. "Thanks, brother." They ate in silence, the autistic boy and the Hells Angel, bound by an unspoken code of honor, a red bandana, and a perfectly cut sandwich. And for the first time since his father died, Toby felt that his routine and his world were completely, unshakably safe. If this incredible true story of loyalty, unexpected kindness, and brotherhood moved you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly deep dives into the most inspiring and jaw-dropping real-life stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Toby's shoes? See you next time.